When we talk about juggling your identity in the church and your identity in your party, there is no juggle. There's no balancing there. There's no, these are not two equal weights. They shouldn't be two equal weights in your life, right? You are a Christian. You should know your Christian principles. You should stand on your Christian principles. And where they come into conflict with your party's ideology or your party's platform, there's no equivocating on that, right? And I think too often Christians compromise that. We'll look away from certain truths because it would actually hurt us.
It's not about trying to be in the middle, but it's realizing that if one side is right about 99 things, that one thing they're wrong on, as a Christian, I got to call it out.
Yeah.
I can't just let it go just because they're more right than the other side. That's not how this works. So we always talk about, it's not about taking a side, because when you just take a side, you're basically outsourcing your public witness.
But the truth is, a large part of the American church has never gone to the cross in broken-hearted humility over racial injustice. Many majority Christians have primarily responded with willful blindness, defiance. Unrepentant, many refuse to show contrition because contrition would involve vulnerability, a lowering of oneself.
Whatever side you take, their influencers, the custodians of that culture, are really the ones deciding what you believe. You give up too much by choosing a side. And we saw this in the civil rights movement, take the right position. If you're not taking a position, that's a problem.
We have to make sure that we're clear that we're Christians first, and that we will question and push back, and we have the courage to do so when necessary. And I think Christians really miss that a lot of times because, again, we're focused on winning. We're focused on making sure that we win this next election instead of saying, whether we win or not, I have to do the right thing.
Good day. I'm so honored to be here at Multiplicity here in Philly. And let me rush to Jersey. I got in late last night. Flight got delayed. No, here in Jersey, I'm just honored to be with you. And I want to rush to thank Pastor Kevin Brown. Met him about a year ago. And since we have kept in touch, he has come with words of encouragement, with words of wisdom, and just look forward to building even a bigger friendship with him. But what he's doing here in Jersey is no small thing. And you see people, amen, good man. You see people come and go in this conversation about unity. You see people kind of fall off and get weary. But we need to remember that this isn't something that we just casually decide to do when we feel like it. Unity within the church, as I said before, is a command. So we all need to work towards it, and I just want to thank Pastor Brown for all that he does. I also want to thank Pastor Besner, who had an awesome message, didn't he, for us? And I think that you will find that there's a lot of my talk is going to complement what he said earlier. So let's get into this a little bit. I would have to say that the American experiment, the workings of this constitutional republic, is at a most critical juncture. Not only are we missing a common story and a common vision, but we can watch the same occurrence from the very same location and walk away with two completely different recitations of the facts. We now force the facts to comply with our narratives, rather than making sure that our narratives comply with the facts. You see, what we have here is a crisis of epistemology, of knowing what is true and what is false, a crisis of humility and a crisis of conscience. Nothing is sacred, and objectivity is discouraged. Those who once told us that character mattered now say that character is politically impractical, if not irrelevant. Those who told us to follow the science now ignore biological and physiological realities when the science frustrates their agenda. Bad blood, bad faith, and bitter rivalries litter our cultural and political landscape, limiting our ability or our willingness to do the hard work of democracy building, which is to set aside our petty hangups and our naked self-interest to work for something that is much greater than us as individuals, to discover what it means to share power and to respect opposing opinions. But sometimes we seem more committed to the fight than we are to the pursuit of solutions. And as a consequence, our healthcare system keeps Americans sick and bankrupt. The working poor can break their backs with 2 jobs and still can't afford affordable housing. And some of our school children are taught the intricacies of sexuality but never learn to read. And the question is, what have we, the church, to say? What is our public witness in this moment of racial and political polarization? We just become merely Republicans and conservatives, or merely Democrats and progressives? Or does the Bible call us to something much more profound? If you don't mind, I'm going to go to the scripture. I want to go to Exodus chapter 1, verses 6 through 11. Exodus chapter 1, verses 6 through 11, and it reads, "Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in number, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt, and he said, 'Look,' he said to his people, 'the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country.' So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities." If you don't mind, I want to get this part started with a very personal story from my childhood, but one that teaches me the value of kind of a civic pluralism and democracy altogether. My father worked at the Denver Water Department for over 30 years. He originally started as a meter reader, the person who would literally go from house to house and read your water meter. And then eventually he was promoted into an office job. And when he went into that new job, he was confronted with resistance. What I'm saying is, not everyone was welcoming or excited about his prospects. In fact, the lady training him seemed determined to make his transition as difficult as possible, to complicate things and to trip him up as to prove to him and others that he didn't belong. And in one instance, when he politely questioned an inconsistency in her instruction, she became irate, screaming obscenities and questioning his intelligence. It became clear that this was more than just a misunderstanding. Something deeper and more antagonistic was at play. The tirade would climax with a physical assault. Swinging an open hand, she would literally slap my father in his face as he sat at his cubicle. Stunned and disoriented, this man from the ghetto of West Side Chicago somehow found the self-restraint to walk away. After all, he had a young family to feed. He would eventually collect himself and do as he was supposed to by protocol, go to HR. But you see, HR had already been tipped off. And predictably, the power structure began to systematically form around the perpetrator to protect its own. And so he was given a half-hearted hearing where a panel void of his peers gaslit him and suggested that he was ungrateful for the opportunity he had so generously been given. In other words, know your place. He would have no internal recourse. The policies in place to prevent such an indignity lacked effect because some lacked the integrity to administer justice. But perhaps we're all, to some extent, inclined to choose partiality over just outcomes that would hold our kinsmen accountable. Either way, silenced and indignant, he decided to go to the office of State Senator Regis Groff, Colorado's second black state senator, a civil servant in the truest sense of the word. So he goes to Groff, he recounts his story, and as my father's representative, Groff goes up to the office and he holds those in power accountable for what they had done. Now, I'm certain that he had other things on his calendar that day. He could have spent the day calling donors and dining with power brokers. There were no cameras, no compensation, nor any awards of recognition involved. My father did not have any big campaign contribution to offer. He didn't have any political or social capital to barter. There was no influence to be peddled. And this wasn't in the formal job description of the senator. But Senator Regis Groff did it because it was right. Because he was a sworn representative of the people and had dedicated his life to advocating for the common man. And as a Christian, you have even more of an obligation. You've even made more of a commitment than any elected official. And truth be told, I might not stand before you today if he had not taken the time to restore the sense of dignity in a man who had been mistreated and was silently struggling with alcoholism. A young man wondering if he had what it took to be a good father, trying to break a cycle of fatherlessness, succeeding and failing and succeeding to overcome the obstacles and temptations of the society around him, facing the struggles of his own making and those of an institutional origin. That advocate did not just bless one man on that day. He blessed an entire family for generations. And if you think about it, isn't that story a testament to the genius of democracy? Isn't it an illustration of the brilliance of our constitutional republic? The idea that even the smallest among us deserves a voice and an advocate. The wisdom to understand that none of us, no individual, no group, are fit to lord over others without their contribution, without the checks and balances of equal representation. What an exceptional idea. And what I want you to hear today is that, yes, some of those obligations to be an advocate are put on you by democracy, but even more so, they are put on you by the gospel. To be an advocate and a neighbor. If we look at Exodus 1, we see what happens when a people is completely without a voice. When Joseph was alive, the Hebrew people were treated fairly. They were allowed to flourish and be fruitful. This is because those in authority recognized his contribution and respected him. Therefore, the Israelites had an influential advocate. But when Joseph dies and a new king comes in to whom Joseph meant nothing, the Hebrews became nothing more than a threat. Nothing more than political abstractions, markers on a war room strategy map. From Pharaoh's perspective, the destinies of the Egyptians and the Hebrews were not tied together. In some, the Hebrews were no longer neighbors. And to some extent, let's be honest, isn't that how we treat our cultural and political opposition? Simply as people to be defeated and treated harshly. We pretend that the state or the nation would almost be perfect if we could just get rid of those conservatives or if we could just get rid of those progressives. But isn't that the same root of detachment? self-interest, and contempt that the new king had introduced. You see, when we read Exodus, we usually do so from the perspective of the Hebrews. But I would submit to you today that all of us have some Pharaoh in us as well. And the more that we ignore it, the more we risk our power becoming our condemnation. The more our arrogance can turn us into exactly what we think we're fighting against. I call this the tyrant impulse. It's the temptation in every group and in every movement to silence or erase others, to unduly prevent them from pursuing different cultural and political ends. It's the urge not to win the debate, but to summarily end the debate through intimidation and force. Now, the tyrant is usually thought of as an individual authoritarian, but it can also be a collective ideological or partisan tyrant, urging the state to do its bidding, using the state to punish its enemies. Those acting on the tyrant impulse can't tolerate political, social, nor cultural disagreement. And what we have to understand is that our parties and our ideologies can be tyrannical when they convince us that we are so right that we shouldn't have to explain ourselves or endure any opposition. The impulse is in all of us. The question is, will we act on it? Those who do not deliberately extinguish the tyrant impulse in their camp rarely see themselves for what they become, especially if they're upholding what they've honestly deemed to be a good cause. But I warn you, it's a misreading of history to say that what all tyrants have in common is an obviously malicious cause. Surely some do, but that's not the common trait. If you look at history, some tyrants have championed what were initially a good cause. What's common among all tyrants is not equal malevolence of cause, but the willingness to violate the human dignity of others to achieve their objectives. The willingness to promote narratives that make others appear to lack value or be unworthy of respect. A desire to crush the institutions that amplify the voice and the agency of others. Under the tyrant impulse, we can't simply say you're wrong and let me show you why. We have to say you're irredeemable and you have nothing at all to contribute. Those who succumb to the tyrant impulse have fallen for the age-old error of becoming evil to fight evil. Just because you're fighting against something evil does not make you good. Notwithstanding Newton's third law, the gospel disallows an equal and opposite reaction of contempt and vengeance. The tyrant impulse relies, as we heard earlier, on compulsion instead of persuasion. So it's obviously incompatible with democracy, but again, I come to tell you that it's even more in conflict with the gospel. Humility, respect, empathy, and intellectual honesty dismantle the tyrant impulse. In the public square, we must all decide whether we will be tyrants or neighbors and advocates. If it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. We ought to take peacemaking seriously, while understanding that even peacemaking can involve disagreement and friction. I'd be doing you a disservice by giving you some kind of flowery message and pretending that we can all just agree, sing kumbaya, and live happily ever after. That's not realistic. There will be necessary conflict and tension when we have fundamental disagreements on life and death issues. As Christians, we cannot condone injustice and immorality to achieve some type of fraudulent peace. So I want you to understand that this isn't an ode to moral relativism or some type of romantic false equivalence where everybody is the same. All opinions are not equal. Some are wrong and dangerous. And I can't tell you to silence your convictions on those matters. There are people that must be held accountable. There are movements that must be vocally opposed. And there are ideas that deserve a very public and democratic death. What I'm saying is that even when in conflict, we can still listen to others and refrain from trivializing their pain. The gospel, listen to this, the gospel allows us to be gracious and tenacious, to love the person but attack the issue. My friend John Anazu calls this confident pluralism, standing on our convictions amidst deep difference while living respectfully and peaceably. But it's hard to be respectful when we believe that our side has all the answers and the other side is responsible for everything that is bad and evil. But Alexander Solzhenitsyn said that the line between good and evil runs not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. If we're not heartbroken, and it doesn't mean we have to agree with people, but if we're not heartbroken that some in the LGBTQ community don't feel loved by the church, or conversely, if we don't lament the suicides and overdoses in MAGA America, then we're part of the sickness that's hurting the society. Again, we don't have to agree, but we do have to love. And we tend to underestimate our rightness and our righteousness. But as far as I read the gospel, it gives us every reason to walk humbly in the public square, understanding that not all our opinions are faithful applications of the Bible, but that some of our opinions are faulty conclusions perverted by self-interest and blind spots. These are issues the Bible addresses directly and clearly, and consequently, we can confront certain things with clarity. The gospel gives us some things very clearly. This is wrong, that is right. And in other places, we should perhaps have a little more humility. Jesus continually chastises those who, like the praying Pharisee in Luke, exalt themselves while condemning others. And as I read the Bible, I see no indication that God's own people had all the answers or had a monopoly on good ideas and good works. From what I read, they were often blessed by outsiders, by their insights, and sickened by the fruit of their own understanding. God gave us the word, but he did not give any one group all the answers. We're broken. Our intellect is incomplete and can lead to destruction. Even our concept of love is distorted. Think about it. How often through history have we used love for our own group as an excuse to treat other groups with wickedness and hate? As leaders, as Christians, we must reckon with our partiality and fear what it could do to those who are under our authority but don't have an advocate in our lives. How could we hurt those people who we don't see as neighbors? And we must rid ourselves of the false and arrogant notion that we or our party or our ideological tribe are intellectual enough or altruistic enough to rule over others without their contribution. Over and over again, history proves that to be false. And I'm not going to say any names, but some of us come from an ideological tradition that oppose the civil rights movement. Others come from an ideological tradition that ushered in eugenics, the killing of certain kind of people because they were not perfect. Conservatism has yet to present us with a perfect meritocracy. Progressivism has yet to prove that replacing God with autonomy or self-rule can create a perfect utopia. The point that I'm trying to make is both of these sides are flawed, and we have to realize that. Neither of them have perfect proof of concept. And here's the problem. We seek near absolute power for one side, but the truth is, none of us are fit to steward it. Let us acknowledge that and be humble as we address our neighbors and seek solutions. We do not have all the answers. And let us not compromise our intellectual honesty out of an eagerness to exalt ourselves and cast our opponents in the worst light. We cannot defend every ideological conclusion that comes out of the mouths of our favorite politician or our favorite talking head, because they're not all good and true. Have we actually wrestled with the best arguments on the other side? Or do we settle for caricatures or the worst arguments to make ourselves feel better and to convince us that there's nothing to see, nothing to learn from people who disagree with us? Are we arguing against their best or just the argument that's most convenient for us? And since it's Black History Month, we can't leave here without some history. I want to talk a little bit about the role that gospel hymns and Negro spirituals played in helping us maintain first principles. You see, often Negro spirituals, as they were saying, as we marched and as we protested, they were actually reminders of the fundamental principles that we never needed a advanced degree to interpret or understand. The truths that were sometimes invisible from ivory towers can be glaringly obvious and instructive in the lowlands of our humility. These songs were often tirelessly repetitive, but not vainly repetitive. They drove home the point. They always provided us with the moral imagination and ethic to walk through Jim Crow's jurisdiction without sword or self-loathing. I'm talking about lyrics like, "Keep your eyes on the prize," which as an adaptation of a plantation song, "Keep your hand on the plow." It spoke of perseverance and how God's promises liberate us from being enslaved by the threats and the trials of the moment. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. And I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on Jesus, with my mind stayed on freedom. Spoke of the resolve to stay on task and to overcome minor and major setbacks while centering Jesus in our every interaction. Another song said, "I'm going to treat everybody right until I die." How simple, yet profound when you think about they weren't just talking about people that blessed them. They were also talking about people who lynched them and bombed their churches. What I want you to understand is that these songs were a penetrating exposition about how those who are committed to seeing the human dignity in everyone will somehow find the image of God in the most hostile manifestations of human brokenness. It speaks to how the only way to see God in someone who hates you is to see what's invisible outside of faith. What I'm saying is you have to want to see it. Sometimes you have to be willing to imagine it despite all other signs and all other indications. You have to love and fear God too much not to see it. That's the difference between wanting redemption for your enemies and wanting vengeance. Let me give you a couple practical disciplines that you can use to make sure that you're seeing other people in a Christian way. The AND campaign, we had a initiative last year that was called Civic Revival, and we went all around the country giving 10 disciplines to help us engage in a better way. Not to say, I put my hands up, I surrender, you're right, I'm not going to question you, but to engage in a way that glorified our God. So I'll give you a couple of those now. The first discipline is seeing people, not political abstractions. Seeing people, not political abstractions. We tend to think that when we meet somebody, if we know how they voted and we know their race, we know everything about them. That's a lie from the depths of hell. You don't know somebody based on those things alone. And it's interesting because the legendary black pastor and educator Samuel DeWitt Proctor talks about an instance when he had been prejudiced against other people. I think he was at a conference in Texas, and he was leaving the conference, and he called a taxi, and when the taxi drove up, it was the type of person he didn't want to be anywhere around. The type of person that some people would call a redneck. He could tell from the hat he wore, he could tell from the shirt he had on, from how he held his cigarette in his mouth, that he did not want to have anything to do with this guy. And so he initially wasn't even going to get into the taxi. But eventually he convinces himself, okay, get in, but I'm going to be ready to attack the first thing he says that I don't like. So he gets into the taxi, he's on the edge of his seat, and they start to drive off. And the man turns around and asks him, he said, did you hear what happened today? And Proctor said, no, man, I didn't hear what happened. What happened? He said, Dr. King got assassinated. And they pulled over the car, and they cried together about Proctor's friend being killed. And Proctor said he felt so terrible for tagging, labeling, and cataloging somebody that he knew nothing about. That he only knew his profile. And yet he had cut him off from any type of contribution or any type of redemption. What we have to understand is regardless of what race somebody is, regardless of how they voted, they may be dead wrong in that, but you don't know their whole story. You don't know their testimony. These are people struggling through the human condition just like us, and yes, they may respond to it in the wrong way. They may make some wrong decisions, but we've got to want God for them and hope that they want God and the cross for us. These are people dealing with drug addiction, abuse, broken hearts. They may be our enemies, but we have to keep in mind that we were once enemies of God. Who are we to shut them off from the redemption? The next discipline I want to share with you is to be aware of the flaws on your side. Be aware of the flaws on your side. I'm not here to say that one side isn't better than the other, right? One side gets more things right. I'm not here to say that's not the case, but neither side gets everything right. And I can guarantee you that we all can list 20 things that the other side gets terribly wrong. But have we taken the time to look at ourselves and say, here's what our side gets wrong. And here's what, even if I'm a Democrat or a Republican, here's what I have to stand up against on my side of the aisle. Because if we truly believe in the fall, if we truly believe in the brokenness of humanity, we know that there is no one group, there is no one side that gets everything right. So here's one way that you can test this. You need to be able to list 10 things that your side gets wrong, either right now or has gotten wrong historically. And if you can't do that, I think you need to be a little bit worried because you may have been indoctrinated. To be indoctrinated is to accept things uncritically, to accept things without questioning it. And what I'm telling you is that a Christian, you can never accept things from the world without running it through biblical scrutiny, without questioning, is this right or is this wrong, based on the compassion and the conviction that a Christian must have. The next one may be even harder, which is to try to find the virtue on the other side. As you heard me say on the screen, one side can get 99 things wrong. But as a Christian, if they get one thing right, whether we like it or not, we have to admit it. And so, can you list 10 things that historically or presently the other side has gotten right that you could learn from? Let me give you an example. So if you find yourself further on the left politically, I think you should be able to look at those people on the right and say, I may not agree with all your conclusions or how you go about it, but thank God that you're fighting for the sanctity of life. Because what if we had a society where no life mattered to anybody and you could just treat life any way you wanted to? Not only that, I look at my friends on the right who I have disagreements with politically, and I say, man, you adopt other people's children. That's part of your culture. I can learn from that. I may disagree with who you voted for, but that is beautiful. But we tend to turn other people, the other side's virtues into vices. We won't even admit that's good. And I would say that if you find yourself more so on the right, you should be able to look at people on the left and say, thank God that they have some sense of inclusion. Because what would America be if we never included other people? And I know right now this is a big point of contention, but I would say in the worst moments of the church, we were at our worst when we did not include people, did not give people a chance to be known and loved and heard. Don't ever buy into the idea that everybody, half of America, everything they believe is totally wrong. Have you gone through all of their ideas? They want you to buy into that dumbed down idea of the other side. They may be generally wrong. They may be very dangerous, but they're human. And maybe if you'll understand why they went wrong or where they went wrong better if you understand what they're going through. If you understand their fears. If you understand the false narratives that they've been fed. Some people don't know better. And who's going to care enough to teach them? Who's going to have the patience and the love to say, brother, I'm going to withstand some of the things you're bringing to me because God did it for me. In conclusion, I think in order for us to respond to this moment faithfully, we have to have what I've called moral imagination. We have to go from cynicism of being cynics of the other side to having moral imagination when we look at the other side. And you may say, what is moral imagination? Moral imagination is the ability to see not simply what has been historically or what is in the present moment, but moral imagination for the Christian is the ability to see what ought to be. It's hope in the midst of oppression, division, and vitriol. It's not a pipe dream. It's more like the Hebrew vision of the promised land yet to come. Moral imagination is what convinced Frederick Douglass to learn how to read and how to write while he was still in chains and when nothing in his physical line of sight told him he would ever be able to use those talents. Those with moral imagination refuse to lower the standard just to win in the moment. They refuse to lower the discourse just because their opponents have chosen to wade in the mire and the muck. They have the capacity to play by the rules even when they lose at the hands of foul play. It takes moral imagination not to have an opposition-centered public witness where everything we think about in our political decisions is based on being the opposite of conservatives, based on being the opposite of progressives. Faith produces moral imagination, and moral imagination affords us the vision necessary to build a better civic space even when the prospects of doing so seem bleak or irrational. It seems bleak and irrational that we could ever come together as a church today, but somebody has to have the moral imagination to believe and to know and have the faith that it will happen. Because God said it would happen. The civil rights movement was an exercise in moral imagination. It was the demonstration of the vision and the endurance necessary to build any great work of civic architecture. It was the most muscular display of public democracy shaping this country has ever witnessed. It didn't overlook the present, but it wasn't limited by the present. Do we understand that? We know things are bad right now, but are you arrested? Is your mind and your spirit arrested by what's happening in the White House or what's happening in this state or that state? Are you arrested by it, or are you ready to transcend it? When the civil rights freedom fighters sang songs about keeping their eyes on the prize, I want to let you know that they weren't talking about a prize that they could physically see. They were referring to a prize that had to be imagined through the lens of faith. They were describing an end result that was not blurred by the myopia and the problems of the present. That even when their eyes were swollen shut by batons and blinded by tear gas, they could still see the reward of a faithful public witness and of having dignity. In this moment in society, it seems like doing wrong gets you to where you want to go. It seems like doing wrong is politically expedient, but it will take the church and Christians with moral imagination to say doing right always gets me to where I need to be. Doing right and treating others right will always be the answer for me. God bless you.